going to put on a presentation very briefly. Share screen. I believe you should all be able to see it now.
Perfect.
My interest in Cuba started from childhood, as my parents were architecture students in Havana in the mid-1950s when everything started to go upside down or sideways. They left Cuba, and I was raised in the Washington, D.C. area in a Cuban household. And like many first-generation Americans, I just always assumed that Cuba was off limits. And so my early research had nothing to do with Cuba, but rather Spain, 18th century Spain and Rome. I guess I was interested in that 18th century as I was a product of two American universities founded by Enlightenment figures, Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin. But Cuba kept tugging at me, and eventually I reached a point where I said, I have to go. I have to have an in-the-flesh, visceral experience. And since then, I've been very active working on Cuba, Cuban architecture, as well as continuing on Spanish 18th century topics. The work that I'm currently doing called Cuban Modernism, Mid-Century Architecture, with a colleague of mine here, is a project that started off with an exhibition that we had here at Coral Gables Museum, followed by a publication with the German publisher Berghauser due next year, and then a much larger archive of Cuban architecture that we're building at the University of Miami in the Cuban Heritage Collection. Many of the architects and their families who left Cuba after the revolution have with them still quite a collection of photographs, slides, ephemera, and we're assembling those to build this archive of Cuban architecture, which we hope will be a great resource, not just as an archive, but also as a digital humanities project. So I'm going to run very quickly through some of the topics that we're dealing with in this project, this book, beginning with the Cuban house. Modernism in Cuba was always linked to colonial traditions. And one of the leading figures, Eugenio Batista, coined the expression of the three Ps, patios, portales, and persianas, which were what he felt fundamental, essential elements of the Cuban house, and that marrying those with more modern, streamlined technological advancements would allow Cuban architects to retain their identity, yet at the same time participate in a much larger project of modernization. So you see here on the left, Mario Romagnach, his house for José Noval de Cueto with its courtyard above the pool. You can see the wooden louvers on the glass, and also the elevated columnar portales, you could say, on the lower floor. One of the themes we also are dealing with is looking at Cuban architecture as a transnational and transcultural phenomenon with projects outside of the island, everywhere where Cubans were practicing, be that Pennsylvania, as you see on the lower right, in the image that Mario Romagnach designed for his family house, a kind of Cuban modernism meets Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water, set among the trees, or wherever Cuban architects would be based. So you'll see in my presentation images from Cuba, but also elsewhere. We also wanted to look at prefabricated affordable housing. This is a phenomenon that started early in the 20th century in Cuba, and certainly within the 50s, there were several projects such as Guanabacoa that you see on the upper left that were being produced during the Batista regime. It was not simply a post-revolutionary phenomenon that affordable housing was a concern, though admittedly there weren't that many projects at the time. And we see on the right images of prefabricated housing in Santo Domingo and in Puerto Rico by Jose Helabert and Rosa Navia, both of whom sadly died this year, and below right by Nicolas Quintana. We are also concerned with the modern city and the influence of European architects and planners as they came to Havana, Varadero, Trinidad, producing new master plans, beginning with the works of Pedro Martinez Inclán, who was instrumental with Jean-Claude Nicolas Forestier in developing the kind of Beaux-Arts French character that we see in Havana with the Paseo del Prado, the university, etc. But also more mid-century, we see the reconfiguration of what was the Plaza Civica, again, another public works project by Batista that is today celebrated as one of the more important spaces of post-revolutionary Cuba. And then finally, the hugely ambitious plan by Nicolas Arroyo, Mario Romagnach, and others for the Plan Piloto of Havana, a complete transformation of the city and its extensions, and a kind of, dare I say, harebrained obliteration of old Havana, a project that would have destroyed much of the colonial old city, as you can see in the upper left. And even more crazy, a casino island on the Malecon that you can see on the right, this rectangular slab, a giant gangster island, you might say, for casinos. The project received tremendous pushback, and the only real, I mean, there were good aspects such as the amount of green space that was introduced in the city, and of course the palatial new presidential palace that you see on the lower left has been generally hailed by architectural historians as a magnificent design, but the plan, like Le Corbusier's plan for destroying the Marais in Paris, was received a tremendous amount of pushback by preservationists. In addition to city planning, we look at new building typologies, high rises, and the role that Cuban architects played in developing high-rise buildings in Havana, but also in places like Miami. The modern high-rise was introduced in Miami at first with the Federal One Tower that we see on the right by Henry Gutierrez, Humberto Alonso, and Pelayo Fraga and Associates. We look at academic cities and master plans, in particular the Ciudad Universitaria by Humberto Alonso, completed after the revolution, and also the art schools by Ricardo Porro, Vittorio Garratti, and Roberto Gottardi. And that tradition of art schools continues certainly in Miami with the campus plan of the Miami-Dade colleges by Hilario Cantela, designer under the firm of Pancos, Ferrandino, and Grafton after 1961. Tourism and leisure allows us to look at the Plan Piloto of Varadero, produced by Nicolas Quintana, and some of the interventions of important clubs and hotels. You see on the lower right, the Varadero International, which was sadly demolished recently to build a big French-designed resort. We're losing quite a bit of Varadero modernism as we speak. Joint ventures with American architects, such as the Welton Beckett, Nicolas Arroyo collaboration of the Havana Hilton on the left, and the Igor Polovitsky design for the Riviera on the right, with sculptures by many Cuban artists. The Tropicana by Max Borges, using a different kind of architectural approach, a much more Spanish Catalan vaulted architecture with thin shell concrete vaults rather than the more streamlined machine aesthetic that we've seen previously, and or some of the Bacardi works internationally, which brings us to the final element, the integration of the arts. You can see specifically in the Bacardi Tower in Miami on the right, the mosaic facade, the mural designed by Francisco Bernand. This is, of course, something that's deeply Cuban, the integration of the arts. Excuse me, the one last project, the Ciudad Deportivo, the sports complexes south in Rancho Boyeros by Nicolas Arroyo and Gabriela Menendez, and also Quintana's works in places like Puerto Rico. Bringing us then to the relationship of art, architecture, and design, the synthesis of the arts. Many Cuban architects were also painters and sculptors, and Cuban modern architecture believed in that Bauhaus synthesis. And so we see people like Hugo Consuegra spending half his life working as a professional architect, but continuing in his abstract painters. We see Ricardo Porro designing, should I say traditional Campeche chairs, wooden cane chairs for Margarita Cano. And we see a woman named Mirta Merlo Vega. We also wanted to highlight as many women as possible. Mirta Vega, who designed furniture for the Cuban Tourist Commission office in Havana. We touch upon landscape. We touch upon projects such as the magnificent, no longer existing timeless cylinder in the lobby of the Biscayne Tower by Raul Alvarez, Henry Gutierrez, and Rolando Lopez de Rubet. That's that project. And I would finally just conclude by saying that I'm also the president of the Cintas Foundation that since 1963 has been giving fellowships to Cuban architects, artists, musicians, writers. We were established through the generosity of the late Oscar B. Cintas, who was a Cuban ambassador to the United States in the 1930s. He gave us some of his collection of old Spanish masters. You can see the El Grecos on the upper right, the Murillo and Rivera's on the lower right. And we, every year we give prizes. Last year, and hold exhibitions. We have a collection from our fellows. So you can see the Carmen Herrera and the Zivia Sanchez. And every year we celebrate the finalist exhibition with a finalist award ceremony with an exhibition of up and coming Cuban artists. So that's my presentation. I look forward to hearing everyone else's.